Welcome everyone. In this short video, we will discuss how to write the formulas of ionic compounds. Example is let's say you have a compound made up of aluminum and oxygen. What would its formula be? Its formula depends on the charge on the ions. Aluminum has a 3 plus charge because it wants to lose 3 electrons, and oxygen has a 2 minus charge because it wants to gain 2 electrons. And what we do is we crisscross these numbers onto the other side as a subscript adjacent to the atoms. So aluminum ends up with the 2 down here, and oxygen ends up with a 3. As simple as that. What about transition metals? Some transition metals like iron can have variable charges, such as Fe can be 2 plus or 3 plus. What happens when I combine that with oxygen? Oxygen is always 2 minus. So in this case, you end up with FeO. Notice that you do not end up with Fe2O2. Why? Because ionic compound formulas are the smallest whole number ratios. So if I had a 2 and a 2, 2 and a 2 cancel each other out. And we end up with 1 and a 1, which we simply write it as by default without the numbers, FeO. In the other case, we end up with Fe2O3. All right. Finally, how to name these compounds. So, aluminum and oxygen coming together give us aluminum. We keep the name of the original metal. The first one is always a metal as it is. Aluminum, and the second one, the non-metal part, becomes oxide. Oxygen becomes oxide. What about these two on the right, FeO and Fe2O3? Notice that for aluminum and oxygen, I did not state the number of aluminum atoms or the number of oxygen atoms. Why? Because these are ionic compounds. In ionic compounds, the numbers we have in the formula, such as the 2 for aluminum and 3 for oxygen, those are simply ratios. That does not mean that there is only 2 aluminum or 3 oxygens combining together. But the ratio, no matter how many aluminum and oxygen there are, the ratio works out to 2 aluminum and 3 oxygen. But when we name it, we do not say that we have 2 aluminums and 3 oxygens. But by that logic, when we look at the two compounds on the right, the FeO and Fe2O3, we might say that both of them should be called iron oxide because the numbers don't matter. But if that was the case, then how do we differentiate them? Well, the way we differentiate them is we state the number, the oxidation number or the charge on the metal part in parentheses in Roman numerals. So this is iron 2 oxide, iron 2 oxide. Why? Because the 2 comes from here, and down here we have iron 3 oxide. The 3 comes from here. Finally, I want to talk about polyatomic ions. Polyatomic ions can also give you compounds that are going to be ionic compounds. Let's have a look. If you have polyatomic ions such as sulfate, okay, has the formula SO4 2 minus. This is called sulfate. If I combine this with iron such as Fe2 plus iron versus Fe3 plus iron, or aluminum 3 plus, what would be the formula and what would be the name? Well, combining with Fe2 plus, as you have applied the rules previously, crisscross the numbers from both of the ions onto the other side and keep the simplest whole number ratio. So here we end up with FeSO4. Here we end up with Fe2SO4 with the 3 crisscrossing on the other side, and notice how I put parentheses here. And finally with aluminum as well, we end up with Al2SO4 3. The names of these compounds are, the first one is iron with the Roman numeral 2 because it's a transition metal, and then the polyatomic ion's name does not change, it remains the same, sulfate. So iron 2 sulfate. This will be iron 3 sulfate. And finally here we have aluminum sulfate. Please take a note that in the name of the last one, aluminum sulfate, I did not have any Roman numerals, as you would expect not to have, because it's a non-transition metal and it can only form one kind of charge, which is 3 plus charge. Hence we do not specify what charge it has. We only do that for transition metals. With that said, what are the polyatomic ions you should know by heart in order to perform well in the exam? There are 10 polyatomic ions that I want you to memorize. Number one, well, actually 6 of them you can apply this rule of no smoking, please. We have talked about this in the class if we met in the class. But this will make it easy. If I write down a 1, a 2 and a 3 for each of the words. Now we have N, we have S, we have P. So our first 2 compounds start with NO, the next 2 start with SO for S for smoking, and the last 2 PO. The O represents oxygen. Now the only part to memorize here beyond this is that the 2 NO compounds, you have 2 oxygens and then 3. Here you have 3 oxygens and then 4, and then here you have 3 oxygens and then 4 again. The number of N's and S and P, they always remain 1. Finally, what about the charge? Well, we wrote down 1, 2, 3. That's the charge for the entire column except it's negative, so 1 minus.